Today we're going to address how the church throughout the centuries has influenced marriage, and we're going to look also at the influence of the modern age, which began someplace late 18th, early 19th century, and how that has also affected the institution of marriage and family. And we're going to seek God's will and His way throughout it all. To quote Alan Wisdom, marriage is embedded in human creation. I love that. We've kind of explored that over the last few weeks, that marriage is embedded. It is in us. We were created for relationship, and particularly in marriage. We've claimed in this class, as taught in Genesis 1 and 2, that marriage is between one man and one woman, was designed to be monogamous and indivisible, characterized by fidelity, and with economic and social benefits. We explored the meaning of one flesh, as we read that in Genesis, in marriage, and the spiritual significance of that as it relates to our one flesh union with Jesus Christ. Carry over from the Old Testament's understanding of the union with Yahweh. And we reviewed last week the scriptures on marriage, and by the way, there's more than we talked about, but the essential ones that have influenced us on this definition of marriage. We also talked about sexual immorality, what that was, and I think we began to get a glimpse of the marriage practices of the ancient Near East and into the first century. So here we find ourselves talking about how the church has influenced as we go forward. Historically, in every society, and I obviously could not have done, there's complete careers done on this study, but the ones that I read and the summaries that I had read and the statements I had read, in every society, marriage has endured because it fulfilled so many of functions. It offered a structure that determined how property was to be handed down, how labor was to be divided, how children were to be cared for, and how companionship would be assured. But the history books, as well as the Bible, record breakdowns in this structure and the effect that it's had on society. Next week we're going to talk a little bit about that social data and some of the results of this breakdown in our time, but we're going to see throughout history there has been disconnection and then reconnection. There's been discontinuity and continuity. We've been called back over and over and over again as we break down what God's intent was. And it's influenced the full expression of love and marriage in such a way that fulfills God's intent. Now, the early church, we need to know, the early church historically was born into the first century into the Greco-Roman world. The basic unit of this urban life, which you can read about this in the New Testament stories or letters that Paul writes. You can get a glimpse of this. The primary unit of urban life was the household. And this would include, obviously, the fathers and the mothers, the husbands and wives, the children, but also slaves. It included some business associates and hired laborers. So when you talk about the household in the Greco-Roman time, and actually into the Middle Ages, it included this gaggle of people over which the head of the home was the male or the father. The New Testament professor at Columbia Seminary, Charles Cursor, writes in his book, The Letters of Paul, says the household was actually a microcosm of the city. Yet the social practices of the first century Greco-Roman culture, which of course we've hit on, included adultery, some promiscuity, sexual prostitution, and it was characterized by this rigid patriarchy. This was always pressing in on the early church, which, by the way, was a minority in this culture. A minority made up of Gentile converts, pagans, who practiced all kinds of stuff, but also the Jewish converts to Christ. So you had this fledgling little minority group of Jesus followers living in this large Greco-Roman culture that had its own way. And though the Jewish law had these very strict implications and stipulations about sexual relationships and marriage, how the law applied to these pagans was still kind of confusing. And of course, we also see in that time the influence of the philosophers that actually began influence the Greco-Roman culture some 500 years before. So who are some of the philosophers that come to mind that we even today would call upon? Socrates, right. Plato, the guy named Xenophon, and then we move into a little later Aristotle. Socrates in the 5th century BC, this was right, within the 500 years before Christ, he offered culture, he referred to women as the weaker sex and said that that being born a woman was divine punishment, since a woman is halfway between a man and an animal, unquote. You're seeing how these things influenced the Greco-Roman culture. Xenophon said, he was a disciple of Socrates. He said that the ideal woman was the one who, quote, might see as little as possible, hear as little as possible, and ask as little as possible. Aristotle would say this in 384 BC. The male is by nature fitter to command than the female, and this inequality is permanent. And between the sexes, the male is by nature superior and the female inferior, the male ruler and the female subject. He also said that the courage of a man is shown in commanding and of a woman in obeying. A guy named Pericles, he's an Athenian responsible for the building of the Parthenon, actually. He argued that it was the duty of an Athenian mother to live so retired a life that her name would never be mentioned among men, either for praise or for shame. You see, this was the culture into which the early church was born. And what we see here is this countercultural witness began in the 1st century with the writings of Paul, and of course, Paul, follower of Jesus Christ. The church leaders began to give counter-witness to this Greco-pagan way, particularly as it related to the relationships between men and women. Paul's letter to the Ephesians was written in the middle of the 1st century, and is probably the most developed image of Christian marriage we see in the Bible between wife and husband. Here Paul would mock the wisdom of the Greco-Roman world and offer this radical option for marriage that would influence generations to come. Now keep in mind, if you were a Christian, whether you were Jew or pagan and had come to Christ, and you were this fledgling little minority group living in the midst of this culture, Paul's words would have been astounding, particularly to the husbands, but also so encouraging to the wives. Let's listen now as we read together. I'm going to read this. I don't know if you brought your Bibles. If you have, you can follow along. I'm going to read from Ephesians 5, about 10 verses. I want you to listen as if you were in this 1st century. You are, whether you're a woman or a man, and you've just heard what the wisdom of that age was about. Listen now to Paul's words. Wives and husbands, be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, be subject to your husbands as you are to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, just as Christ is the head of the church, the body of which he is the Savior. Just as the church is subject to Christ, so also wives ought to be in everything to their husbands. Hang on, ladies. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, in order to make her holy by cleansing her with the washing of water by the word, so as to present the church to himself in splendor, without a spot or a wrinkle or anything of the kind, yes, so that she may be made holy without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as they do their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. But no one ever hates his own body, but he nourishes and tenderly cares for it, just as Christ has done for the church, because we are members of his body. And for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a great mystery, and I am applying it to church, to Christ and the church. Beautiful, beautiful, and sometimes controversial, depending on how this has been interpreted by the church with regard to the superiority of men and the inferiority of women. Believe it or not, the caveat I mentioned, some of this domination of women is still alive in the church today. But let's unpack this a little bit. You see that what we need to look at here is that mutual submission was being discussed in this. I love this. Be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. Christ in the church is the model for the relationship between husband and wife. And headship in the marriage is modeled after Christ. And what we saw in it was a servanthood and a tenderness and a sacrifice. And husband loves his wife, his own body, his wife's body as he loves his own. So what was particularly countercultural into this culture at the time is Paul's teaching of this mutual submission and a redefining of the meaning and purpose of headship in a man. Into this culture, the church would say husbands were not to lord over their wives, but to serve their wives. This was what Christ did for the church. Into that culture, the church would say wives are to be honored and cared for tenderly and nurtured and made holy, to be present to God, empowered and equipped, as Christ did for the church. Into that culture, the church would tell husbands, love her body as he loves his own, which was a reference to monogamy. Just as Christ loves and is faithful to the church. And into that culture, the church would encourage women to submit to this kind of husband, where she would be safe and honored and encouraged and presented worthy before all and before God. And into that culture, the church would say that the wife, as a suitable helper, is strong and equal to the family and the task of family and fruitful community life. Though differentiated in gender, of course, in some roles that would come from that, she would be equal in power and value and purpose and possibility as it would be with the Trinity. So into that hierarchical culture, the church would talk about this mutual submission in marriage. Not being a command, but a voluntary surrender of one's own life. Incidentally, this is historic, but this applies today. You know, we're talking about this whole session about what's in it for us now. This is the teaching the church began in the first century about the relationships between men and women. And this understanding about submission that would exist today, not being a command but a voluntary surrender. It results only as both are being continually filled by the Holy Spirit. It's mutual and applicable to all believers. And both submit to Christ, who is the head. And so this mutual submission is not something one does, but it's something one receives. As Christ submitted and sacrificed himself for us, we receive that grace. It's not an action to be attained in a marriage, but it's the attitude of the heart to be maintained. Now, I don't know about you, but for 28 years of marriage to Mr. Ron, we're still working out that submission thing. Anybody else? And I just want to suggest that there can still be a reconciliation between the view that women are submitted to the male as head of household. And in my case, God called me into a certain vocation that historically had been closed to women. But as we interpret this scripture for us in our marriage, in that example, rather than be relegated to a role that would be feminine, God called me to the church. And the headship in our marriage, my husband Ron, is the one who protects that call. So in that sense, he has not lorded over me, but provided me the protection that God created him to do. As a woman is called to serve God and serve her family, a submissive, mutually submissive marriage will allow both to flourish. But I will say, generally my husband is the tiebreaker, and he is here. So as we work through this whole things of submission, you see though how radical it was in that time when dramatically the woman had no voice, the wife had no say, And into this culture comes this beautiful, beautiful illustration of submission, one to the other, as both submit to Jesus Christ. As the church grew in number, what we find here is that all of this affected how women and men treated each other, and they will know we were Christians by our love. Wives for their husbands and husbands for their wives. All of this began to be noticed by the culture. And as they grew in love, what we're talking about is this agape love, and it became a necessary ingredient in marriage. This agape, mutually submissive, lover even though you don't want to kind of thing, became an ingredient in marriage. And the church literally commanded it from their interpretation of this passage. Not a romantic, self-serving love that we're going to talk about in a minute. Marriage was characterized by the love of Christ for the church to whom they both submit. And they were noticed for that in the midst of that culture. How their men loved their wives and how their wives loved their husband. Now, as the Christian church became institutionalized, and what we know now is the church began in the Middle East, right? It began in the Jerusalem area, in that part of the world. And as you read through the book of Acts, you see that Paul, in his mid-century ministries and his mission trips, ended up spreading the gospel into Europe and into Asia. And so as the gospel spread in this first millennium, you see the influences of the church's teaching wherever they went. And the teaching is contained also in the writers of the early church fathers. Now, I don't know, I'm kind of a church history geek. Be glad I didn't give you everything that I learned in seminary and since about church history. But it is important to know that there were these guys called the church fathers. There were a few church mothers too, but they don't talk much about them. But the church fathers were those first, second, third, fourth century Christian leaders who continued to influence marriage in their culture. Europe and in the Middle East, and some of them we've listed here. Of course, the 12 apostles continued to write, and Peter and Paul and Timothy, all of their writings in the New Testament. You can get glimpses of what their teaching was that was being taught and then filtered into the culture. But then you also had, as Christianity spread, what we called Christendom, which basically everybody, it was a Christian nations. Christianity was institutionalized and formalized and became the religion wherever you went. And so out of that, you see these fathers, church fathers, Origen, Clement, the Cappadocians, Athanasius, St. Augustine, Tertullian. Anybody heard of any of those?
Yes.
St. Augustine. And I know some who are well-read who love reading that stuff. Right, Ken? When you read their writings, some of it is like, really? Again, influenced by the times. But some of the writings that they gave the societies and gave the church are exquisite as it relates to wedding, or as it relates to marriage. St. John Chrysostom in the 4th century said, "Husbands, you have seen the amount of obedience necessary. Now hear about the amount of love necessary." And he goes on and says beautiful things. He says, "One's partner for life, the mother of one's children, the source of one's every life, every joy, should never be fettered with fear and threats, but with love and patience. What kind of marriage can there be when the wife is afraid of the husband? What sort of satisfaction could a husband himself have if he lives with his wife as if she were a slave, and not with a woman by her own free will?" That whole free will thing was radical. He says, "Suffer anything for her sake, but never disgrace her. For Christ never did this with the church." And then he gives some advice on how to talk to your wife. He writes this. Guys, listen up. "I've taken you in my arms and I love you, and I prefer you to my life itself. For the present life is nothing, and my most ardent dream is to spend it with you in such a way that we may be assured of not being separated in the life reserved for us. I place your love above all things, and nothing would be more bitter or painful to me than to be of a different mind than you. 4th century writing, still in a time of patriarchy. Chrysostom would also give some instruction for husbands and wives to build their marriage spiritually about praying at home and go to church, and when you come back home, ask each other questions about the scripture and the prayers, and be sure you humble yourself so that your words are full of grace and kindness. And he says, if we order our lives in this way and diligently study the scriptures together, we will find lessons to guide us in everything we need. Unquote. We realize too, St. Augustine of Hippo in 410 would write something called the Good Marriage. Now, in his time as well, there was still a lot of what's called dualism going on. In other words, bodily things evil, spiritual things good. This was alive and well in the church, and there was this understanding that anything related to the body or physical things were not considered to be good. St. Augustine enters into this dualism, and he writes this beautiful thing called the Good Marriage, in which he says that marriage is not evil, but it's good, and he used to believe that it was. And it was for the procreation of children, and he says, born in an ordered way, pleasing to God. You have to understand, St. Augustine was a philanderer before he was converted and had a child out of wedlock. So here we have this man who's saying, revisiting God's plan, and he writes it for the church. He also was the one that said marriage had a sacramental quality to it, a holy and great mystery that later the Catholic Church would take on and include marriage as a sacrament. The Protestants reversed that. But you see, this movement that marriage was less just a convenience where the woman had her role, but this beautiful agape love, mutual submission, tender talk, the nurturing of faith together, the raising of children in an ordered way, was being taught by the church. Now, as for the marriage ceremony itself, it's interesting to know in the medieval times, and I know, as I say, we could still be in the 1st century if we had time, but we're moving into this first millennium. And the marriage ceremony itself, though they were arranged and officiated and ordered by the family at home. So the weddings took place at home, and it was still a family thing. They were very informal. They had not been legalized in the same sense that we do today. We might remember the wedding at Cana that Jesus was at. It took place in a home. And the wedding would not have involved the Roman government at all. But the church still regulated marriage practices. About 1000 AD, marriage ceremonies moved into the church. And in Europe, for example, it became witnessed by the public. There was a community that was gathered, presided over by a priest. And in England, I've handed this out for you. In England, in the 16th century, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer wrote a beautiful marriage liturgy. And it's in your handout. I would encourage you to read it. One of you be the priest, or you could pretend like one's the bride and one's the groom, because the whole liturgy is there, written in the 17th century and 16th century. It was written in 15-something. What's it say on there? 1540? 1559. This you will see in the vows that were written in this liturgy. Are vows and the order of worship that we still see in our weddings today, unless they're like bizarre and they happen, at the casino in Las Vegas or someplace. But when a service is put together today, we still see the elements of that, the welcome of the guests, the intent. You'll read it in the 16th century language. We say it today. Is it your intent to be married? You see this exchange of rings that go on that were symbols of faithfulness and a covenant. You see the giving away of the bride. We still say, who gives this woman? Unless you're in a modern context, and there are women that say, nobody's given me. We also see now where there's multiple families and 3 or 4 stepfathers, and which one is supposed to give the woman away? who gives this woman is often answered by all of us. All of us. But this giving of the bride, this turning over of the bride to the groom, you still see. And you see these vows. You also saw that communion was celebrated. Again, the communion of the body, the husband and wife, union in flesh, celebrated beautifully in the union we have as we receive the sacrament. And of course, the kiss. Right now, it's kind of a slobbering deal. I saw something on the internet not too long ago where at the very, very end of the wedding ceremony, it was hysterical. The priest said, "You may now kiss the bride." And they launched into this crazy dance that including, the pastor was dancing, the whole congregation was dancing, and the wife and the husband were dancing. They just took, and after they kissed, they took the kiss way over the top. It was a celebration, which is true, but actually the kiss was designed to be the passing of the peace. And it was designed for all to share. At the closing of the marriage service, where we are all reminded that we are united in Jesus Christ. We are all the bride of Christ, and we were reconciled in that kiss. Isn't that beautiful? And how we've kind of gotten away from that. Now let me talk a little bit, let me finish up here. Back on the vows. I want to talk about the vows for just a minute. When the liturgy came into the church and these vows were written, they were an approved liturgy. The vows in that time codified this marriage commitment between a man and a woman. And to this day is an integral reflection of this covenant between God and the people. And the vows made some assumptions about to what they would be obedient to. Taking a vow would mean making a promise to fulfill them. Now, moving on really quickly here, in 1175, marriage was placed under what's called canon law. Before, the church had been influencing it, but then it became part of law, and it was regulated very specifically in the church. The ritual of posting banns came along. That meant we're going to post something so that if anybody knows that somebody's marrying their cousin, or just to announce, sort of like the equivalent of our wedding announcement, but these banns were posted to make sure that the intent was honorable. Consent became required by both. Now, up until this point, there was still arranged marriages, but the church had seen the wisdom of mutual consent, man to the woman. And also the age of discretion was mentioned. In the Roman culture, girls as young as 12 could be married, generally to older men who are at least 5 to 10 years older. But the church said, no, there's no more child marriages. And they literally listed an age of discretion banning them. Slaves had to marry where prior they could not marry because, again, the church looked at marriage as a sacrament and something holy, and it should not be denied anyone, including a slave. They had kind of mixed views on eloping. It's kind of interesting. Most parents went, no way, but the church is saying a marriage is a marriage and it's holy, therefore they kind of approved it and really had to mediate the family drama that would come from an elopement. Now, another caveat, the church had a particular teaching in medieval times about singleness. In the medieval times, singleness was considered superior to marriage. And you'll see some of this sort of implied in Paul's writing. And that's where they took it, where Paul said it is better not to be married. Anybody remember that in his writing? But if you're burning with lust, get married. So he almost talks as if, well, if you can't help yourself, you have no self-control, get married. And if you're a widow and you can't help yourself, get married again. Personally, I think it's better not to be married. So the church kind of took this teaching a little bit to the point where there was a monastic movement. And what that meant is singleness was still considered superior. In monasticism, actually the word means alone. It's a root word meaning alone. And what you see is that these men and women would reject marriage and they would retreat to solitude, sometimes by themselves or in groups, and remain single and celibate. The medieval church taught that this was the better way, in some cases, to follow Jesus. was to remain celibate and unmarried. Now the Reformers reversed this trend. We come off that tree. As Presbyterians, we come out of the Reformed tradition, which is where the church actually ended up branching into two. We had the Christendom, only way to go in the church, that became the Roman Catholic. And in the 16th century, the Reformation came, technically to reform some of the practices of the church. And this was going on in Switzerland and England and Germany and France, predominantly all over Europe. Reforms were brought to the church. You remember Luther, Martin Luther, who made some decisions that there was some indulgences and some abuse going on in the church, and so he listed them. Remember, he posts them on the door in Wittenberg. Out of the Swiss Revolution came John Calvin. The Swiss Reformation came John Calvin. And they took this business of monasticism and reversed it. And there was a movement back toward marriage. In fact, Henry VIII, now he was a pesky guy. The English Reformation had an interesting beginning for political reasons, so that he could marry, divorce and remarry when he didn't have a male heir. And the Roman Church wouldn't let him do that. So England established the Church of England. So interestingly enough, the Reformation came there out of a political necessity, but also with it came some teachings on divorce and remarriage. I would have to say that Henry VIII's teaching on marriage fell short of what God's intent for marriage was. But Martin Luther was quoted by saying that marriage was pleasing to God, and continence, though a gift from God, was rare. Continence means self-control, the ability to hold it all in, if you know what I mean. It comes from the Latin word contentia, which means holding back. So this business of continence would apply to chastity. Hold back the sexual urges, not move forward on them. And it led to this business of monastic living. Protestants and singleness a little bit. Let me digress a little bit more on the issue of singleness for a Christian. There are a number of you in this room who are single. And there are a number of our friends who have never married, or who were married very late in life, and were wondering, why am I single, and what is the holiness of being single if God's intent for humanity was to be married? Has anyone wondered that? Well, especially when we see young people marrying so late and are single longer. What is their status? What is their lifestyle in singleness? Though the Reformers would decry monasticism, the Protestants today have corrected the value of singleness. We kind of reclaimed the fact that it's not just marriage and singleness is secondary. They've reclaimed the value of that, even as they lift up marriage. And contrary to our culture's teaching, singleness can be holy, and celibacy is possible. Says one single Christian woman, "Apart from a direct word from God, I'm not convinced that anyone can know they're called to a permanent, lifelong singleness. Those in the Catholic faith have the charity of a mandated vow of celibacy to accompany their call to full-time ministry. Protestants don't have such a clear choice. Of all the Protestant singles in full-time ministry who I've read or know about personally, all have a desire and a hope for marriage. But for one reason or other, it simply never worked out yet. But they also have come to the realization that their desire for marriage is one more thing that gets to be laid on the altar of living a surrendered life. They've also discovered exceptional grace to live life with much joy in undivided devotion." Unquote. She goes on to say that singleness is one of those things, for me anyway, that require acceptance of the grace that God gives you for today, and to not worry about whether you'll have it for tomorrow, next year, or the next decade. Seasons of life change, and I believe that one can live in obedience acceptance, and contentment for the present season, trusting God to prepare them for the other seasons that may come. God rarely, if ever, gives us a spotlight into the future. However, I understand wanting to know. I questioned God ceaselessly in my late teens and early 20s till I realized the answer He was giving me was, trust me and wait. Now this is from a heterosexual young woman who wanted to be married but was single. I read an article briefly about a gentleman who is gay and has chosen to be celibate. In fact, I'm going to get his book. I just came across him, and I think it would be of interest to us to learn what is it like to be gay and to look at celibacy as an option. Stay tuned, because I think it would be good for all of us to read that, a testimony from a gay person who is single. So a Reformed understanding of singleness is that it is not mandated, but it can be holy. Moving on again, we talked about Henry VIII getting this divorce. There's this little ditty that back in the Henry VIII that said, King Henry VIII to 6 wives he was wedded, one died, one survived, 2 divorced, 2 beheaded. Suffice it to say, it was for political reasons that he was divorced, not saying it was biblical. But of lasting significance in society in Western Europe in the 17th century and beyond, we see John Calvin, who wrote this beautiful treatise called Marriage Ordinances, written in 1546. He's our daddy, if you will, of the Presbyterianism. But he made marriage and divorce. He had some new regulations about marriage and divorce, children's welfare, sexual sin that mattered in both church and state, and many of the reforms that he and others had initiated, new rights and duties for wives in the bedroom. Believe it or not, I'm anxious to read what that's all about. Understanding, though, that sexual expression in marriage could also bring pleasure to the woman. Fault-based divorce on grounds of adultery and desertion, protection for impoverished widows, and more have made their way into civil and common laws on both sides of the Atlantic. John Calvin's writings influenced our marriage laws today. And he was instrumental in reversing the canon law on marriage that said marriage was a sacrament. And this is just, in our tradition, baptism and the Lord's Supper are our only 2 sacraments. We have not lifted up marriage as a sacrament. Yet, this is what was kind of cool. He affirmed that civil magistrates are accountable to God and also ministers of the gospel. And he's the one that began the practice in the 16th century of the cooperation between church and state in matters of marriage. Licensing came from the town hall and officiated the marriage, legalized it, but the wedding took place in the church. Marriage disputes were always handled by the church, and if you had a dispute in your marriage, your session would haul you in and hear about it and help counsel you, but it was the state that granted divorce. Calvin stressed the importance of this mutual attraction and the free consent of the parties of their parents. So what he did is develop this cooperation, which we see today. Now I officiate in a wedding, sign off on the wedding, and that makes it official, but it still needs to be filed, recorded with the state. This cooperative relationship between church and state in marriage came about in part because of Calvin's work. Now, the Reformers again emphasized that marriage was a community thing. And this is a restoration. This is a restoration, that marriage was a community thing. Do you remember when we've talked about marriage for the common good, for the procreation of children, is a building block of society? Well, they reclaimed this in significant ways, binding the couple and the state and the community together for the common good. Now, you're going, yeah, duh, but that had gone afield, and he was restoring this. Now, divorce actually became rarer after all this, up until the 20th century. 19th century England, only 1 out of 1,000 marriages ended in divorce. Unfortunately, there were a lot of desertions. With the influence of the church's teaching until 1853 in England, it actually took an act of parliament to get a divorce. Think about that for a minute. If you wanted a divorce in America and it would take an act of Congress to give you a divorce, chances are the divorce rate would be pretty low, right?
And the marriage rate.
What's that, Ken?
And the marriage rate, perhaps.
Yeah, and the marriage rate perhaps too, like, oh no, if I can't get rid of this woman or this man, then I'm not marrying in the first place. But the reasons of hardness of heart, do you remember we talked about Jesus' terms saying, well, you know, you can get a certificate of divorce. Even with an act of parliament, you can get a divorce. But the church continued to talk about hardness of heart, and that what was between a husband and a wife, the good, the bad, and the ugly, started in the heart. And it continued to be interpreted and discouraged as a reason for divorce. And it was working. Between the 17th and 19th century, marriage standards and laws remained closer to the biblical ideal that marriage would be monogamous and permanent. And as for the welfare of children, 17th century Europe, only 2 to 3% of children were born out of wedlock. And the universal norm around the world was that a child would be raised by a mother and a father. Sadly, there were desertions, but the norm was still being raised by a mother and a father. The influence of patriarchy and politics and power would continue to challenge marriage, but the records of marriage in the later part of the 19th century did show happy marriages. John and Abigail Adams, for example, if you've read anything about them, they had a very beautiful, loving relationship. And while legal subjugation of a wife was still the law, as far as property and voting, Abigail argued publicly that husbands should be denied the absolute power over their wives that had traditionally been theirs, and John seemed not to have too many problems with that, though she probably pushed the envelope a time or two and stepped over them, the boundaries. But listen to this. She never put herself in competition with her husband. Kind of thinking about Ephesians 5 for a minute. However, she says this, however brilliant a woman's talents may be, she ought never shine at the expense of her husband. Kind of a submissive woman indeed in every good sense. So there were marriages, even with the laws and even with the stipulations, that were happy and continued to get happier as love, agape love and tenderness and mutuality became more and more a part of marriages. But as we finish our time together, we see that the influence of the modern era has really assaulted marriages. It was continually and ultimately grew weaker by the new forces of modernity, which marched into the 19th century and into the 20th, of course. With this came these downward trends, and we're talking about the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution and things that were changing how society ordered themselves. The middle class began to grow, and what we see here was there was an economic function of marriage lessened. The necessity of a husband and wife working side by side to build a future and to build a community was replaced by financial independence. Young men now had money in their pockets, and they could go and find the bride they wanted and even pay for the wedding, regardless of the parental involvement. Economic security, purposed in traditional marriage, began to be derived outside the marriage. We see that today, and Ron and I spent the weekend talking about our net worth and whether or not, if anything happened to either of us, would we be okay, because we were looking at our Social Security and we were looking at our retirement plans. We were looking at all of that. And so financial security, not a bad thing, was no longer rooted in what the two could provide for one another or what a family would provide for the spouse should they die. And also we see separate bank accounts and separate financial arrangements. The other thing that was huge, and we see this today, and we're going to talk more about the statistics of how this has affected marriages. Romanticism of the 18th and 19th centuries prevailed in society, which meant that passion became central to the ideal of a Camelot marriage. You'll see that in the literature, and you'll see that in everything you read, this romantic era that affected marriage. Children became marginalized as the couple's happiness became primary. You see these trends. And as people took more control of their love lives, they began to demand the right to an end to unhappy unions. And divorce became much more commonplace as we go into the 20th century. And with the no-fault divorce laws that landed in the mid-century, divorce has exponentially increased. And see, marriage then became a contract just between the couple. And the community as well was marginalized, except as spectators to the extravagance that was the wedding itself. This was evident in the trend of couples writing their own prenups, temporary mutual convenience pacts, and they write their own vows now, rejecting the language handed down by the Christian tradition that had established healthy and godly expectations for marriage. Here's one vow I came across that was written recently. The groom. I promise to love you as much as the Chicago Cubs and not hold your black and white striped dress against you. From this day forward, I will listen to all of your complaints about the mall if you say them during the off-season. And I promise to retire my baseball cap and face paint for public outings. I will love you in sickness and in health from this day forward until death parts us or you become a White Sox fan. The bride, I promise to love you as much as I love my credit card and not hold your poor fashion sense against you. I will only show you my new clothes during commercial breaks and promise to keep you in the latest Cubs fashions. From this day forward, I will make sure your lucky shirt is washed for every game day and will have plenty of potato chips on hand. I will love you for richer or poorer as long as our credit limit stays high. And he goes on, I promise to love and cherish you as much as I do our dog. From this day forward, I will lint roll the chairs whenever your parents visit. I will love you in sickness and in health as long as you take care of the vet visits. I promise to cuddle with you as much as I do Spot and pick you up treats whenever he gets some too. And then the bride. From this day forward, I promise to declaw my cat Fluffy so that you are not scratched. I will always make sure the litter box is clean and will keep Fluffy out of Spot's house. I will love you for richer or poorer as long as Fluffy gets the gourmet cat food. I don't know if this is real or not. But reflecting on the deterioration of the significance of marriage vows, C.S. Lewis in the mid-1900s says this: making and keeping of vows is a matter of justice. He writes, someone may regard this promise made in a marriage ceremony a mere formality and never intend to keep it. Who then was he or she trying to deceive when he or she made it? God? Himself? The in-laws? Most often, I think the couple, or one of them, hoped to deceive the public. They wanted respectability attached to marriage without intending to pay the price. If they're tempted by the hard duty of chastity and fidelity and are serious about resisting them, the promise restrains them. If they never intended to keep the promise, this is dishonest, unjust act committed before witnesses. Very strong statement that we're going to look at next week as to what happens when these vows are taken lightly. So going on, we see other trends that affected marriage in our times: mobility and urbanization, and contraceptives that allowed the purposes of sexual pleasure to be separated from sexual fruitfulness, and weakened the link between sex and marriage and children. Today, couples can have sex outside marriage if it makes them happy. They can marry without having children if it makes them happy. They can have children without marrying if it makes them happy. They can marry anyone they want, regardless of gender, if it makes them happy. They can have children without sex, if that makes them happy. And so we arrive at 2014, where the moral equivalent for marriages might have changed a bit. Perhaps we could say the moral equivalent now is that if two people love each other, they should be allowed to marry, make up their own terms in marriage, and end it if it doesn't work out. And we're asking now, how has that worked for us? Indeed, we have come to a time where the culture has now defined and influenced what marriage should be. And as Christians, we need to ask, what have been the consequences of redefining it to suit ourselves? Next week, we shall consider the social data on love and marriage and all the alternatives that our culture has offered us, sadly, that have failed. There is hope, though, great hope, as one from the Reformed tradition, that we can indeed reform our understanding as we seek God's plan for us. And I would like, we have a minute or two before we scoot, and it is raining, so if you'd like to stay out of the rain a minute. Any questions at this point, or concerns or comments, perhaps of what we've been talking about together these last few weeks, that I can assist with? I know it's early in the morning and it's a lot of information. Well, as I have encouraged you to do, if you could continue to jot your questions down, and on this worksheet this week, fill in the blanks. Historically, marriage has endured because it has fulfilled so many personal and social functions in society. I encourage you to think about what those might be. In the first century Greco-Roman culture, the household was the microcosm of the city, and the head of the household was always the husband. So how did this affect marriage customs? In Ephesians 5, Paul offers this counter witness. Wives and husbands were to be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. So how did this mutual submission demonstrated in marriage? In 1000 AD, the marriage moved into the church from the family domain, and the church regulated marriage practices. The couple made vows to each other that described the responsibilities each had in marriage. And the reformer John Calvin, in Marriage Ordinances 1546, reclaimed the biblical understanding of marriage, provided new rights and duties for women and children, and emphasized that marriage was a community thing. It was to bind the couple, the state, and the community together for the common good. And then finally this week, I'd encourage you to revisit the influence of modernity in the weakening of marriages, and use your worksheet to remember those. And to God be the glory. Dear God, we thank you for marriage. We thank you for the church. We thank you for the way in which the church has influenced marriage. And as we understood, as we read the narratives in the Bible, we know that just because it's so doesn't mean you've commanded it, condoned it, or approved it. So help us be faithful to your model for relationships and marriage as we strive to be holy and set apart for your glory and for the good of the world. In Jesus' name, amen.